Greetings everybody, this is Derek Baker. I'd like to be speaking to you in person, but it's a sign of the times, difficult times, we can't meet in person. So I've recorded something and I hope you'll take a bit of time to take a look at it. I've chosen to stay out of your hair over the last few months, given the challenges that everybody's been facing. That's introduced a few delays in this project, and for that I apologise. That's my doing. But in any case, some information about the project here. We've done a workshop and some consultation. I've been to visit all of you, I think, except one company. We're looking at barriers and opportunities around the digital systems and particularly innovation, and we're trying to contribute to an industry strategy for chicken meat. Now, it's a scoping study, and a scoping study is essentially looking for good ideas and trying to assemble information about how those good ideas might be implemented. So just as a bit of a primer, I think most people are aware that the performance of the chicken meat industry is very strong in some regards. It's the only meat industry in Australia where real prices have actually been falling. It's also the only one where consumption is continuously increasing, and ABARES forecasts for the next 10 years around about a 1.2% increase in demand, and a lot of that predicated on the likelihood of the prices of the other meats increasing. So there is some information around about industry margins and industry costs. I guess many of you will have a bit of a giggle at these kinds of generalized costs. I think on the one hand, they show a profit margin at each one of those stages, but I think the more interesting part is to look at those costs and how much they contribute to the formulation of margins in the industry. And I guess the challenge for digital is which one of those costs can be attacked, and how effectively can that be done. Now, there's a few anomalies around those calculations, particularly which costs have been included, and we've had a go at deconstructing that a little bit and putting that together in some kind of industry simulation model, where we've taken a look at, if we shock the system in terms of changing costs, what will that mean for the industry as a whole, and who will benefit from that? Now, some conclusions from this sort of high-level analysis of the industry is, one conclusion is that chicken has really become a commodity, and that's moving in a different direction from perhaps some of the other Australian red meats, where product differentiation and value added is very much on the lips of everybody in the industry. Certainly within the chicken industry, there's plenty of initiatives around value addition, but really the cost minimization objective, prerogative, let's say, driver is there for everybody in the industry, particularly around that achievement of a standardized product. A lot of these developments lend themselves towards scale, and there's a big focus on essentially what powerful retailers are looking for. The industry is segmented into a contract supply model, and there's questions and I guess constraints around how much processors can actually instruct producers to do. When it comes to things like generating and sharing data, the extent to which different kinds of equipment or different kinds of practices can actually be mandated. And there's open questions about who actually owns the data. Does it belong to the same party that owns the chicken, or the same party that owns perhaps the device that's collecting the data, or the facility within which the data is being collected? And that's a question I don't have an answer to. So one might think that something like high technology in the agricultural industries has a long history of calculation of return on investment. Actually, it's hardly ever been done, and not very well. We don't know what the return on these investments are. We don't know who they're going to accrue to, and we don't know what a reasonable time frame for those investments is going to be. And we find the time frames being largely tied to cycles of production. For example, a contract for delivery of chicken to a processor, if that's a 5-year contract, then many of the operators within the supply chain are going to be looking at those 5 years as a time for a reasonable return. Now, of course, this is not the beginning of AgriFutures, not the beginning of AgriFutures research on this. There's a past piece of work released in 2017 regarding the use of digital technologies and what that would mean to the industry. Chicken meat is one of the strong beneficiaries, apparently, of those kinds of projected benefits, and notably many of those benefits would flow to processors rather than to producers. There's also work going on, some of which I'll mention, on specific technologies and their practical applications that's being funded by AgriFutures, and many of them centre in on these five main activities for production, which are implicated by a lot of AgriFutures work, and which really forms a starting point for what we're up to. So we had a workshop to talk about digital aspirations. We chose 2030 as a sort of a target date. Maybe it was safely out of reach, and we didn't see it being on the far side of something like coronavirus, but for one reason or another, we used 2030. And there's some aspirations there, particularly about moving towards real-time kind of data collection and processing and use, automation, but not automation necessarily in the sense of getting rid of all the labour, but really freeing up people to do what people do best. There's also mention of platforms, which I'll come back to a bit later. So the impacts are going to be, there's that strong driver for reducing costs and increasing productivity, but also something around increased prices. So certainly product differentiation, and as we've seen in most other industries, a big driver of product differentiation is when information can be stored on board a product, such as its information about its production methods, its origins, its provenance, and so on. And those kinds of variables, if they can be loaded onto the product, they can command a price premium, and that's so that something can be done around margins. Certainly there's a desire to get into prediction and analytics, and that's certainly a fast-growing area, particularly around bespoke software, rather than published information on literature. So that's something I'm going to need a bit of guidance on, just which kinds of software and services people would like to find out more information around. Also, there's this idea that data can be connected, and particularly I think we think there about different points in the supply chain being connected, processes with producers, processes with retailers, perhaps thinking about processors and producers with regulatory agencies, and this is something I'll come back to. So what's that going to look like? So there's some sensible talk there around confronting a world which is really awash with data, and there's people who make a living on writing about just how much data we're actually producing day by day, and then trying to understand which of that is useful. So we're only going to collect the useful stuff. We're going to try and leave all the rest out there, as we might say. There's also a big drive towards treatment of objectivity, and I'll talk about benefits that might be available from that. And something of a transformation within firms and in perhaps in society at large, but particularly within firms. And we discussed that in terms of digital transformation. And at the workshop, my colleague Masuda Zen was working on that. So what we might see there, the purpose of it all, what we would judge to be success, are really indicators that most industries would aspire to, particularly food industries. And I guess the story is to see where the digital revolution, the digital transformation, the uptake of digital decision making, how that's going to get the chicken meat industry towards those ends, because I don't see that as being so strongly embedded in the aspirations of a lot of the other industries, food and otherwise. So we tried to work our way towards some key data, and we used two methods for that. Firstly, the industry design workshop. We tried to set up something that was matching the physical supply chain to its digital twin, as it were. Also, I had in consultation a bit of talk about what commercial auditors want, but I also branched out a little bit and looked at what the external interest groups were looking for in terms of audit. Some of the perhaps more pedestrian and mundane issues around the security and the biosecurity surrounding chicken production sheds and chicken processing units, looking at certification and even environmental issues around construction of new plant or compliance for existing plant. And for all of these, I tried to generate a set of data, and this is what I'm referring to as the data wish list. And most of these data points were mentioned at the workshop, but they're also supplemented by some of the discussions I had before the workshop and since then. So taking forward that data wish list, we've put together a literature search. That sort of thing's always going to be incomplete due to the constraints on time and resources and things. And also one wonders about just the orientation of it, whether we should be looking for the science involved or the results that the commercial providers are getting. In any case, we've done quite a bit of literature research really across those subjects there, and then tried to map the key data that we looked at to certain key technologies, and in doing that mapping, tried to get at these sort of strategic development questions like which are the key technologies, how can they be incorporated in business models, and looking forward, who's going to do what. And I think this is really a key issue with any strategy or any sort of policy consideration. It's what do firms want to do for themselves and really don't want to collaborate with others on doing it, for which things are collaboration really necessary within a firm and its supply chain, or between supply chains across a whole lot of firms, or what's a role for the industry itself, or indeed for government if we're looking at some kind of social benefit. So in very broad themes here, and this is just a summary really of things discerned in the literature review. So weight, of course, of birds is central to most management issues, and there's a whole lot of technologies which are being applied to that measurement of weight. And I guess what I would say is that while there's a lot of data streams that are available there, and I'll talk about the constraints on their use in a minute, while there's a lot of data streams available, the standardization of data and the broader scope of data and the number of variables which are being measured in a standard and accurate way, those are the things that contribute to the use of artificial intelligence and some of the decision support tools which come out of measuring something like weight. So weight distribution is identified by a number of people in the industry as being really vital to improvement of margins. Firstly, the breadth of distribution of weights is associated with rejections from buyers, but also even the heavier birds that are accepted, one doesn't get paid for the extra weight, so there's a lot of feed being wasted here. There are many of the optical and other kinds of sensing technologies can get past some of the bias around weight, and that heavy birds won't get on automated scales. And there's technologies available from the egg industry surrounding the sexing of embryos, which could be used to separate out birds to get rid of sex bias. There's sensors working on that too, although we didn't find any that's really ready for commercial use. So also looking at some of the practical aspects, I spoke to the machine vision project from University of Queensland. That's an AgriFutures project, and those folks are using 3D cameras to estimate a number of variables about birds in commercial conditions, and noticeably they're using cell phones to overcome some of the problems of transmission problems from sensors inside metal construction sheds. So some interesting practical stuff coming from those kinds of applications. Once again, that ability to bring things to the party in terms of machine learning is really around the integration of data sets which have been designed and implemented with that in mind. So once again, just the integration of existing data into decision tools is really requiring of the discipline around how data collection systems are designed and implemented. Now, on to some other issues around at the production level there. Certainly, a lot of work's being done on gas sensors. There's some practical issues around how reactive gases like ammonia can be handled and the longevity of the sensors that are there. Optical devices of many different colours, shades and types are being brought to bear, particularly on things like behavioural issues like how often birds lie down and what their gait is and those kinds of things. A number of technologies that are there for measuring weight in particular, but also a number of other sensory kinds of variables. Many of those are specifically designed for research purposes and really aren't there for uptake within the industry. So just one thing I've mentioned here is that this coordination of data and the sourcing and collection and curation of standardized data sets. Certainly there are bespoke software sellers out there, and here's the Amino suite offered by MTech, where really they're offering end-to-end solutions, and essentially we'll have a wish list of data, possibly not unlike the wish list from the workshop, where those kinds of that kind of decision support can really be embedded right through the system. So moving on to talking a bit about shared management. And here's this a case in point regarding benefits available from objectivity, and essentially the measurement wouldn't necessarily need to be particularly digital, depending on what one wanted to do with it. But I understand that in the RSPCA compliance, one commentator told me that there's a description of the way the litter needs to be. In particular, it needs to be dry and friable, or some other descriptive term like that. This is something which really lends itself for good reasons to objective measurement, and if that objective measurement could be made and presented to the users of it, there's a lot of saving in time and energy and frustration in terms of providing that kind of thing. So a lot of talk around about the automation of certain unpleasant or dirty jobs that people need to do around chicken sheds, or more constructively perhaps freeing up labour for what it's more useful for in particular. So there's an automated task there. But also some recent developments are for those kinds of automated items, or we might call them robots, actually putting sensing equipment on them, such as cameras, which will be collecting data as they rove around in amongst the chickens in a non-disturbing kind of way. That is, collecting data that perhaps humans could do, but humans create too much of a disturbance while they're in there. So that's a case of ganging up the technologies. So I'm going to talk a bit about end-to-end kinds of things just initially here, and in particular, certain use of really reasonably cheap equipment, like say surveillance cameras and so on, can be used just to give indications of things like whether a shed is ready for a restocking of birds. If there's a truck to be dispatched with a new flock on board, it would be nice to just get a quick snapshot, some basic data about the condition of the shed, without having to bother to call ahead and get some kind of assurance from the shed owner. So really looking at fairly basic kinds of things that could be transmitted reasonably easily. At the other end of the scale, that's a restocking question, but also just the automation of from food service outlets or retail shops. The automation of supply and restocking is something which is very advanced across a number of industries, and that can provide, there are many digital applications, and once again, we're talking about the world of bespoke software here, about ordering and the presentation of those products. The little set of scales there, that's just a snapshot of activities by a company called LeanPath in the United States, and they've focused on food waste in food establishments and in the catering industry. And they're a company that offers a service not only in terms of measuring waste and providing management advice about how it can be reduced, but also in providing prescriptive kinds of measures with regard to supply chain sourcing of food and its packaging and many other elements which will reduce food waste and with it considerable cost within the supply chain. I've talked to a number of people about aspects of monitoring labour and work, and in a different context, worker health and safety. And there are a number of digital applications around people logging into equipment before they use it or barcoding themselves. And anyone who's bought a beer in a busy bar will see the bar staff log into the cash register, I guess, so they keep tabs of who's doing what around the cash register. But perhaps more importantly here, things like how much labour time is being expended on different kinds of activities. It's always going to be useful in terms of management and predictive sorts of activities. And then there's worker health and safety in terms of who's using which machine, extending on to things like maintenance of the machine and what particular machines are being used for. A number of people have expressed concerns about really a lack of whole of chain knowledge about who comes and goes from chicken meat farms on the one hand, but also chicken processing plants on another. And surveillance and the ability to read license plates and keep track of vehicles is useful for a whole lot of ways surrounding security and biosecurity, but also thinking about things like our current context of who's traveling where in the coronavirus era, and also looking at things like which kind of contaminants might be carried from which locations to others. Moving more into the processing world, and this is something that our literature review is rather incomplete on here. In particular, there's demands which are growing from retailers, for example, for packages of product which don't necessarily conform to the confines of a carcass. So they need a certain number of standard sized cubes in this case, and there's experience in the pork industry with producing these. These kinds of demands need a technological and really a digital response to them in order to supply that kind of product. And this is really just one example. And there's once again, bespoke end-to-end kinds of solutions about doing that. So everyone's talking about blockchain these days, and Food Agility has been working with the beef industry to produce a beef blockchain called Beef Ledger, and that's something that has been successfully implemented. The demands on a beef industry blockchain are very, very different from what they would be with a chicken meat situation, and it's really a case of deciding whether those kinds of technologies with regard to the data storage and the access to data and the use of data that individual actors in a chain would want to put it to, whether or not that's suitable in the chicken environment. So I've talked enough about those objects of measurement in RSPCA and so on. I took the liberty to talk to a few people involved in regulation, and in particular talked to people at New South Wales Environmental Protection Authority, New South Wales EPA, and asked there whether there was any, across any of the food industries, whether there was any initiative there to actually monitor remotely or to measure remotely any of the variables that might be involved, for example, for an application for a construction permit, or indeed the operation and compliance of food processing or food production systems. And really the answer was, well, you know, the variables that we're measuring, things like odor in the chicken in the outdoor environment, we don't have technologies for measuring odor, but the New South Wales EPA were quite interested in the idea that there might be, for example, information about fan use in chicken production units. The increased fan use is often what predisposes towards increased odor, and of course, fan use is in response to a number of internal house conditions that might be prevailing. But there's opportunities there to link these kinds of data sources and save a lot of time and energy around the regular reporting and these kinds of activities. So moving on beyond thinking about which data and which technology many commentators are thinking that food industries and the chicken meat industry is heading towards the operation of platforms. Now, I've very arbitrarily divided here really into 3 delivery mechanisms, one within the firm, one where a third-party consultant comes in to provide a service based on data, and the other one is where there's a central repository of data, and the data is curated and preserved in various professionally desirable ways so that it can be accessed by service operators on the one hand, or it can be a basis for the development of apps by other service operators, and a whole string of services are available to food industry participants if their data is collected, collated, and stored within that platform. So that move onwards towards sort of platform management, from what I've learned, that's really around waiting for one of the big companies to invest the capital and invest the, I guess, the promotion involved in setting that up and finding the right linkages with competitors. If one firm sets up a platform, then there are sort of mixed incentives around whether to invite competitors to work on that platform. And a lot of that will be decided on just what kind of service they might be offering. Across the board here, we've really got constraints around sharing firms between sharing data, excuse me, between farms or up and down the supply chain. That's competitive advantage, which might be given away. That's also bargaining power with regard to prices. So a lot of this is going to be a constraint on our delivery mechanism, and we need strategies to get around it. We also face along the way issues of data ownership, data confidentiality. Does the data belong to who owns the birds? Does it belong to who owns the facility the birds are in? Or does it perhaps belong to the person who owns the data collection device that collected the data in the first place? And these are questions to which there aren't readily available answers. So my colleague Masuda Zaim had quite a lot to say at the workshop around digital transformation as an experience that firms go through, or indeed industries go through. And there's some fundamental sort of considerations there that I'd like to put in front of chicken meat industry. Which areas of the business are being transformed, and we're leaving aside the demand that consumers have for information that's included in a product, which I mentioned earlier, thinking about customers not only as being consumers, but also being retailers or processors. To what extent can the experience of those parts of the food chain be transformed by digital? And to which tasks can they be alleviated from? Which risks can they avoid? And what kind of assurances can they be given? And one can make similar sorts of statements based on a lot of what I've been talking about tonight on transforming the operational processes and moving forward to looking at where is there actually value to be extracted and how do firms work together in a business model. So there's some sort of, I guess, mental exercises that are needed by any firm that's contemplating, next steps and strategy around digital transformation. I'll just draw your attention to that third bullet point there. Any firm or industry going through a transformation needs to think about how it takes care of its assets. And if we think about the labour supply in the chicken meat production and processing industry, we have unique conditions in Australia surrounding the long distances associated with logistics, the regulatory environment, very high diurnal temperature fluctuations, water shortages, and so on. Many of these features of the chicken meat industry in Australia are not shared by the industry abroad. And we have a well-developed labour force here, which can exhibit high levels of skill and stockmanship. And we don't want to replace them with digital technologies. What we want to do is augment what they do, complement what they do, and magnify what they do. And that decision around assets, is going to be a key one for people looking at how to implement digital. And then there's questions about, how to integrate with others in terms of sharing data. And I think the chicken meat industry is probably more familiar than any other one in Australia with how to integrate certain activities like quality control. So really it should be something that is somewhat second nature in terms of sharing data. And I guess it's an open question why that hasn't happened to the same extent. And then there's these, in some sense, it's a bit philosophical questions, but some of them are pretty profound, like how is digital transformation going to be funded? And that might not be a one-off kind of experience, and it might not be a case of the same person investing the money as actually benefits from a particular step in the process. And there may be introductory kinds of arrangements whereby producers go through certain changes for which they're paid, provide data for which they're paid, or it could be that processors build data acquisition and storage into prices they charge and so on. There could be a whole lot of different ways around how digital transformation is paid for. So for feedback, and despite delays and everything else, I'd like to get feedback from you, and in particular, which technologies would you like to see more information on? Because we've got a whole jumble of stuff put together, and I'd like to make some sense of all of that. Also, really, that task of digital transformation, any sort of feedback on whether you think that's something that you're going to do within the firm or something along your whole supply chain, or really all the supply chains that really constitute the whole industry, are those going to be the ones involved in that digital transformation? And we might think about something like readiness for the arrival of platforms, for example. I haven't said nearly enough about barriers to digital transformation, and many of those are going to be specific to individual firms or stages of the supply chain. I'd certainly like to hear more about those. And as I started this discussion with, really any sort of strategic consideration should be around who is going to do what. So I'll finish there, and really look forward to your feedback. I'll come chasing you if I don't hear from you, and apologise in advance for from that intrusion. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to meet me on a number of occasions, and apologise again for not getting back to see you. That's just a sign of our coronavirus times that I wasn't able to do that. And I want to thank my colleague Masuda Zine for a great deal of work he put into literature review and thinking through digital transformation.